Welcome back to the Tech Startup Network podcast. Joining me today is Elvia Perez, an associate at Las Olas Venture Capital. Elvia, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. I would love to start off by having you share with our listeners more about who you are and what you do.
Of course, yeah. So to give you guys a little bit of background, I am an investor at Las Olas Venture Capital, and we primarily invest in B2B software. So really anything touching applied AI, vertical SaaS, workflow automation. Our average check size is anywhere between 1.5 to 3 million, and we typically invest in seed stage companies, prefer to lead deals. And that's a little bit about what I do. I'm an associate on the team, so pretty much helping the firm with deal sourcing, writing investment memos, also hosting events, a variety of different things, which is always great. That's how you really learn a lot in this industry. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity, and then also happy to jump into my background as well.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I'd love to go. So thank you for bringing that up. I'm really curious to hear what led you into VC and what that journey has been like.
Yeah, of course. So I was born and raised in LA, and then after that, I went to Brown. I studied economics, minored in political science and entrepreneurship. And during my time at Brown, I started an edtech company called EmpowerU to really help students go to college. So we provided them over $2 million worth of scholarships, internships, summer programs, and also having a social media component to it. I did that for a little bit, so kind of started it. And then from there, after I graduated Brown, I did investment banking in New York, and I transitioned out of that because I quickly realized I wasn't super passionate about that space and I wanted more of a purpose, really fulfilling, mission-driven kind of role. And so I didn't really see myself in investment banking for the long term, but I transitioned out of that to actually finish, EmpowerU and continuing what I had started in college. It took a year and really focused full time on EmpowerU. I went through a couple of accelerator programs, including Pledge LA in LA and Techstars as well. So I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and I pretty much was able to do a couple of national pilot programs and fully launch EmpowerU. So we were in the Apple Store and we had a couple of great relationships with high school districts in the area, a few in LA and Florida as well. So I learned a lot from my time in that operating experience. And then from there, I transitioned over to venture capital. So before Las Olas, I was at Inicio, which is an impact agnostic venture capital firm, and then joined Las Olas a year ago in May.
Oh, I love that. And so I'm curious to hear because I love that you kind of like went back to empower you. And so was there a defining moment that made you realize that maybe it was time to close that chapter and go into VC, or I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so for me it was a really I feel like everything I've done in my life has always been about helping others and making a social impact in this world. And I remember it was pretty much like the first month of doing investment banking, and I realized I really wasn't making an impact or making a difference in people's lives. And I also realized something important about myself is I am more so extroverted. Like I love connecting with people, building relationships. And investment banking is pretty much, sitting in front of a spreadsheet or PowerPoint all day. So you don't really get to cultivate a lot of those relationships or have meaningful conversations with, intelligent individuals like you do in venture. And so that's something that I knew was missing for my life. And I also just, um, heard from a lot of people that they ultimately end up regretting decisions they don't take in their early 20s. So I knew that my end goal was to find something that was fulfilling and something that I was going to be very passionate about. So I made that transition as soon as I realized, investment banking was just not where I wanted to be within the next 5 or 10 years, and why not make the jump? And really pretty much went back to empower you because I knew I wanted to, finish what I had started and continue on that road and ultimately be able to, create something meaningful with that.
Yeah, I love that. And with Empower You, did you exit or what was that process like of transitioning from Empower You to now Las Olas?
Yeah, so pretty much not an exit. I would say more so ended up really focusing on the social impact aspect. So it almost felt more like a nonprofit organization for many individuals out there who are familiar with the education sector. They know it's very challenging kind of industry to get into, very long sales cycles. Ultimately, you have to have very strong connections. And for me, the end user was different than the buyer. So we wanted to help low income first generation high school students. And so the school districts would be having to pay for the service, but I also wanted to be super accessible. So I made everything free intentionally. And to me, it ultimately, was my whole purpose was just to make an impact and to make a difference in people's lives. So, more so continue doing that on the side for a couple of years afterwards, and more so kind of treated it as a social mission, driven organization where we didn't necessarily prioritize profit. It was more so, okay, how many students are we able to help? How many scholarships are they able to take advantage of? It's something that's very near and dear to my heart, given that I am a first generation. I do come from a pretty humble beginning. I got a full scholarship to Brown University, and I do think that there are a lot of students out there who have that potential who just aren't aware of the resources that are out there. So that's why I built this. This was something I wish would have existed when I was younger. And ultimately, I do think that a lot of my success comes from hard work, but also luck. And as many people say, you don't necessarily get lucky, you just are prepared and you are put in front of the right opportunity. So once, preparation meets opportunities, that's when you ultimately get lucky. And so, definitely wanted to bridge that gap for more people.
Oh, I love that. That's such good advice. And I love that you shared too that Empower You really turned into a passion project as just your
Exactly.
way to give back without really expecting anything in return.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And so I think if I remember correctly, you're coming up on your 1 year anniversary at LOVC.
Yes, yes, correct. I joined May 1st, so it'll be 1 year soon. And overall, I've been very grateful for my experience here. When I was applying to VC firms, I did a lot of research, and this one was the one that stood out the most because of the team, the culture, the mission. It is very founder centric, founder driven. And what I love is that one of the many things that I love is that the founding partners have operating experience. So they come from being founders themselves and building something that they've been able to, they were able to sell and have a pretty successful exit. So I think coming from that experience, there's just so much more value you're able to add to founders, and especially when you're sitting on board seats. And so learning from individuals like them has just been such a blessing.
100%. And I've actually heard that a lot lately. Was speaking with other folks in VC that there's been so many founders turned investors. And I think you hit the nail on the head that that experience really does so much for the firm and for the startups that they're investing in, just being able to have that experience on the other side and be able to get it, quote unquote, of what those founders are going through.
Exactly, yeah, and that is one of our biggest value adds because at the end of the day, there are so many VC firms out there, and you are, providing founders with capital, but what is going to differentiate you is that additional value you're able to provide. So not just capital, but the strategic business advice or the guidance or the connections you're able to make for them, and that's the end goal is to ultimately help these founders succeed, get to the next round, and be able to scale efficiently.
Absolutely. And I know at the beginning of the show you gave a brief overview of LOVC, but would love to have you share again the types of companies you're investing in, the stage, all of that good stuff.
Of course, yeah. So average check size 1.5 to 3 million. In terms of stage, primarily seed investments, and we do like to lead the rounds. In terms of specific vertical, so within B2B software, pretty agnostic. We are only investing in AI native companies right now, and I would say pretty bullish on legacy industries, antiquated industries, so anything touching supply chain, manufacturing, industrials, anywhere where you're able to really drive measurable ROI by replacing like manual time intensive processes in these sectors that are oftentimes overlooked. Like that's been really interesting for us to focus on, but again, pretty agnostic. So we see a lot of companies in terms of specific KPIs. Ideally, we like to look for startups that are making anywhere between 300,000 to a million in ARR, ideally within the first year or year and a half of inception. And then geographically speaking, investing anywhere in the US, excluding California. And that's pretty much mainly covers it, but let me know if I missed anything.
No, I think that's great. And I really love hearing about the rise in investing in like industrials and like you said, manufacturing, like the industries that have been long overlooked because there's so much opportunity there for automation and other things as well.
Definitely, yeah. So we are focused a lot on, applied AI that is able to drive and directly automate real workflows in these legacy industries. Like that's something that we've been looking at a lot, as opposed to horizontal AI tools, which I think are interesting, but ultimately are not specific enough to these industries or workflows.
Definitely. And as you're helping to kind of source companies or understand companies that are making that would be a good investment, what have you found is something that makes a startup stand out in this crowded market, especially at the early stage, since that's your focus?
Yeah, really great question. So I would say different things. The first one is we want to make sure that there's a product market fit. So any sign of traction and product validation. And normally we see that through the live ARR, but there are definitely other ways for us to understand that and see that. The second one would be how big the market is. We want to make sure that it's at least a $2 billion market, and that it is growing and definitely a venture scalable industry we can invest in. And then the last one would just be team, because at the end of the day, we are investing in very early stage companies. And so it's kind of inevitable that the product or the idea is going to change at one point in time. But what's going to stay consistent is the team. And so we're betting that this is the right team to execute upon the vision. So those are just three things, broadly speaking, that we look at in terms of kind of specific things that I like to see. For example, with the proliferation of AI, we want to make sure that what is being built is an end-to-end workflow solution. So it ultimately becomes kind of a system of record where the software doesn't just assist with one particular thing or is a point solution, but more so owns the workflow end to end. And that's where you're really being able to see defensibility or long-term value being created. Another thing I would say is proprietary data is just very important. You need something that's going to be able to differentiate you with other incumbents in the space or other vertical startups. So those are just a couple of things. And then the last one that I think has been top of mind for many investors is just seeing growth and distribution, and also the quality of a revenue. And so in terms of growth, like given all of these tools and how accessible it is and how easy it is to build at this era, we want to make sure that the company is able to grow at a very sustainable rate. And also exponentially speaking, we're seeing a lot of companies that are able to go from 0 to 1 million in ARR within the first year. And so that's kind of our benchmark. That's what we've seen is very common now with AI. And then the other thing would just be distribution. So ultimately, is there founder market fit? Do the founders have experience and domain expertise in the space? And that's going to enable them to, scale more efficiently, and that's going to make distribution a lot easier. Who is within their network that can really help them get this product to the hands of many more consumers. So that's always been top of mind. And then the last thing would just be defensibility. And so, like I mentioned, proprietary data, and ultimately being able to understand how hard is this to replicate, and ultimately why is this the right team to really build this product.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, such good points. And I especially love what you mentioned about the team component and knowing that change is inevitable. The product is likely to change at some point in time, but knowing that the team will remain the same, I think is really important note. So thank you for sharing that.
Of course. Yeah, no, I think overall, like a lot of early stage investors emphasize the team and the people more than maybe later stage investors, just because, it really is betting on them early on.
Definitely. Yeah. And also, it's a good reminder, too, that you had mentioned about change happening, because I feel like sometimes, from what I hear, founders can be a little bit nervous about change, about pivoting their product. But I feel like at this point, it's normal to go through another iteration and not have the exact same product that you started out with.
Oh, 100%, yes. And I think the more you learn about kind of a problem and a solution and competitors, like you are going to need to change and adapt with the market. So for example, I've seen this with other firms is that there are some companies that they've invested in maybe 5 or 10 years ago that right now are trying to leverage AI and be able to integrate AI more into their companies. And so we want to make sure that the founding team we're investing in is very coachable, malleable. They're going to be adapting to what's new and be able to really hone in on the new technological innovations that are coming up and leverage them to their advantage.
Definitely. And on that note as well, what are some mistakes that you see founders making when it comes to pitching investors?
That's a really good question. So I would say there are three main components that really go into um, how I'm analyzing those companies. And then from there, I can kind of talk about the different mistakes. So, like I mentioned, product market fit and validation and any indication of traction is going to be very important. So I think as a mistake I see that a lot of early stage founders are making is coming to, seed or pre-seed investors with just an idea. I think that given the access to resources and the technological innovations we're seeing with AI, it really is very easy to build a product, even if you're using platforms like Lovable or other AI platforms, it's very easy to have an MVP build a product and then from there just run experiments and test out to see whether or not there is traction or there is some sort of product market validation. So, I at least want to be able to make sure that founders are coming in and have already made progress. So that's mistake number one is coming in with just an idea. I think that is going to be very tough to get funding in this age. The second one is not really understanding the problem or the industry. And so that's where founder market fit comes along. If you're pitching to an investor, we really want to make sure that you've already done your research, your homework, you're very familiar with the space, you at least have a decade of experience within the space. I think that's very meaningful and obviously not a requirement, but I do think there needs to be, an advantage that you bring in as to why you are the right person or this is the right team to build in this industry and really address this problem. And so something that we like seeing is that founders who have already experienced the problem themselves or have worked very closely to the problem or have already worked a few years within the industry. I think those are the ones that are really coming in with an advantage. And then the last mistake I will say is not following up. And I know this this might be a little bit obvious, but I do think ultimately every single interaction you have with an investor is going to leave an impression with us. So, let's say you take a couple of weeks to answer, to respond, like that is really gonna, I think, indicate something or enable us to make an assumption about the character. So we want to make sure you are responsive, you're very responsible, and you ultimately really do value our time as investors. And so every single small interaction, I think, is a good indication of kind of how a person is performing within, their workplace. And so that's something that we definitely look for.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, those are really helpful to keep in mind. And it makes me wonder too, to your point about like having that experience of investing in operators who already have experience in the space. I feel like one thing I've noticed a lot recently is, or maybe it's just me who notices this, but I feel like there's a big uptick in like 20-year-old tech founders, 21-year-old tech founders. And so I think it's really interesting because up to that point, they likely don't have a ton of experience just given the age and not having much opportunity at that point. But I'm curious if that's something that you've seen and from founders that you've been pitched from, if you've been like invest in young founders. I just always love kind of hearing that perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have seen that trend as well. And something I will say is there are there's kind of a bifurcation within those founders. So for example, I see founders that are very young, but they end up bringing in a CTO or a co-founder or a COO that has many years of operating experience. So
Mm.
maybe, a decade of working within that space and really understanding main competitors and kind of understanding and having a really good network in that industry. So I think that is the smart and right approach. You always want to work with people who are smarter than you and can bring in a lot of value. And then ultimately that's going to add more credibility to the team. And then I see other founders who are bringing in, their friends or people who are kind of within the same years of experience. And I don't necessarily think that is as beneficial as bringing in kind of an expert or someone who already has, over a decade of experience working in that industry and really being able to understand comprehensively the problem that they're trying to address. So those are the two different categories I'm seeing. I will say I do believe most investors are going to favor a team that is very diverse in experience and also in perspectives. And so if you are bringing in people who can complement your skill sets, then that is a team worth investing. It doesn't necessarily matter your age, but I think ultimately we do kind of judge the whole team as a whole. So we're doing diligence on the co-founders, the CTO, like who is the core team that we are investing in, and why do we think that this is the team that's going to win?
Yeah, that's a really great point that they might have a counterpart who kind of fills in that perhaps missing experience that the founder might not have. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And so, as you've mentioned, of course, you really focus on those legacy industries, which of course is a big trend right now, is looking at the older industries that often get overlooked for innovation. But besides that, are you noticing any other trends in tech right now?
Yeah, I think other trends in tech would be valuation. So we have seen valuations pretty much rise throughout the years. And so AI companies are being valued at sometimes egregious price points. And so we want to make sure that we are sticking to the fundamentals and really analyzing a company, not necessarily on only, their potential, but also, okay, what are they currently doing, like what's their current live ARR. So really trying to understand the valuation justified? Because you hear about a lot of these startups, specifically in the West Coast, where they're raising at 20 million post or 30 million post money valuations, and they have zero revenue. And so, for us, that's a trend we're seeing, and many investors can attest to that. And we definitely want to stick with fundamentals and make sure that what we're investing in, valuations are justified, and we're really understanding where they are at the moment within their own financials and why we believe that they are ultimately going to grow into their valuation.
Absolutely. So, since you shared earlier some of the mistakes that founders are making when they're pitching investors, what are some things that you see founders doing that are actually really helpful and really beneficial? So, I know you mentioned like having a solid team, showing ARR, like being able to have a tangible product and not just an idea. What are some things that you've seen founders do that actually set a really good impression on it, potential investors?
Yeah, really great question. So I see a couple of founders really going above and beyond, especially when they are just pitching to me. So, for example, there are some founders who will send an entire investment memo after the first conversation. That is not required, and that is definitely out of the ordinary. But I think it's super helpful because as an associate, as a principal, our job is to be able to really understand what we think is going to be valuable for us to present to our investment committee and ultimately have a strong conviction on the startup we're presenting to partners. And so if someone is able to give you more valuable information in the form of an investment memo or maybe sending over additional information to the questions you've already asked, that just really enables me to make the best presentation with the most information possible. And so it's giving all of us kind of a chance to really see whether or not this is a company that can match our investment thesis and that we're going to be able to help them. And so for me, that's a really big one. Is I've seen people send over investment memos or data rooms after the first call without I don't ever ask for that. And so that is very impressive and in my opinion. Also just being very cognizant about the time. So I know you only have really 20 to 30 minutes to make a good first impression. And I think if you're able to allocate that time in the most efficient way and really help the founder understand, help the investor understand whether or not this is a good fit, like that is probably the best first impression you can make. And so answering all of the questions. And also, for example, I've seen some founders be able to share like a small little demo about the product or share a couple of kind of customer feedback or testimonies and that's all super helpful. And if you're able to do that in a very like concise, direct, straight to the point method, I do think there's a lot of value in just having very good communication skills and being able to direct your time in a way that's more efficient for both of us.
Definitely. And I love what you mentioned, especially for that first point about sharing like the data rooms and investment memos. I mean, it sounds like transparency really is a big driver of just being able to lay all the cards out on the table and really give a peek behind the curtain, so to say, which I'm sure investors like yourself really appreciate.
100%. Yeah. And even just like speaking about attributes that I think are very favorable when investors are meeting with founders, there are definitely attributes that I think enable us to have stronger conviction on the team and the problem. And those include, things like having integrity, being able to, be transparent, and just having a very great collaborative and collaborative approach and great communication skills. So those are all things that we definitely keep in mind and we want to be able to understand and again ensure that this is a good team for us to work with. At the end of the day, it is a very long-term, in a way, relationship that you're building with this team, and so it's really about investing in good quality people that we think are ultimately going to be able to execute. That's another factor that I do want to touch upon is execution is important. So I know when I mentioned, we want to make sure that founders are responsive. It ultimately comes down to how we're viewing their execution levels. Are they able to execute and make good decisions and ultimately, take action and that's what I think is really going to enable a lot of founders to win within this era of AI is like how fast can they pivot and change. And I was just reading the book by the book about NVIDIA and ultimately how it became such a successful company. And one of the things that they attribute their success to is their ability to execute and pivot in a very uncommon, like almost incredible kind of timeline where they don't necessarily have a huge time intensive process to get approvals or things done. Like they're able to really send and create updates within a couple of days and really ship them out as well just very quickly. And I think ultimately that is what we want to see.
Yeah, good stuff. And so, one of the questions I always love to ask our guests too is why their location is such a great area to build in. And so, knowing that you're in Fort Lauderdale, would love to hear why that's such a great hub for tech.
Yeah, and so I great question. I think overall there are a lot of reasons why Fort Lauderdale is a good location. It is a nascent ecosystem, but I will say over the years it's grown to be such a great community. So I just came from an LPGP breakfast this morning in Miami. It's really incredible to see how many investors, founders, and community builders we're getting in Miami and in South Florida. Ultimately, I do believe that this community is just going to continue to grow. You see a lot of people who are moving in and really being more integrated into this community and you see a lot of individuals who are also very passionate and focused about community building, so bringing these people together. I myself host female investor dinners bi-monthly, and so it's been really great so far. We've gotten so many new faces and so many new female investors who have just recently moved to South Florida. And so being able to connect them all together with these live events has just been super rewarding. And again, a huge testament to the fact that this is an amazing ecosystem and it's going to continue to grow. And we're ultimately very much fostering like a very collaborative and driven ecosystem.
Definitely. And I love what you shared about just the theme of community, which I think is so important now, is just being able to virtually and in person put yourself into the circles that you'd like to be a part of, meet people, because you never know what opportunities can come from that. But then also, too, important to see how you can support others as well.
100%. And I think that's something very meaningful about the South Florida ecosystem is everyone, and I was just talking about this with a couple of the attendees there, is everyone is supporting one another. We want to see each other succeed, and we are always looking for ways we can collaborate with each other. And that is very unique. And I do think ultimately, if you're in that kind of ecosystem and environment, it's just going to make a huge difference, especially when you are thinking about co-investments or co-hosting events together. There's something so meaningful about being able to work with people you enjoy and work with really great human beings.
Absolutely. And for anyone who's listening to this episode who potentially followed a similar career path to you, where you didn't go right into VC, if someone's looking to get into venture, what advice would you give them for getting started?
Yes, I would give them a couple of things to do, and this is probably the best advice that I received as well when I was looking for a job in venture capital is really do the job before you get the job. So try to find ways that you can add value to the companies you want to work for, and ultimately try to show them why you would be a valuable asset. So that's something I did when I was interviewing for Las Olas. I created a whole website for them, and I pretty much wrote down my thoughts on a couple of sectors that they had already invested in. I did research on their portfolio companies. I also sent them a couple of deals that aligned with their investment thesis. So really doing as much research as possible and understanding, at this point in time, what would be most valuable for you to send to them or for you to create. So that's been one thing. The other thing I would say is ultimately within the interviews, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. So try to make sure that this is an organization you want to work for and you want to make sure that you're working with people who you admire both professionally and personally. And so I was able to do that and I pretty much listened to many different podcast episodes and read many blogs that the people on my team had been involved in, and I was just blown away. I was very inspired, and I knew that this was a team that I would be able to learn and grow so much from. So those are a couple of pieces of advice, and I hope that's helpful. The last thing I'll say is there are so many free resources that are out there, so I would definitely encourage people to apply to fellowships or programs that they can do to better understand the fundamentals of venture capital. Oftentimes, there is a lot of jargon that you're learning within the first few months of being in VC, and so it's helpful for you to kind of already be a few steps ahead of that curve. So, for example, I did a venture capital fellowship after I had worked on my startup, and that is ultimately what helped me land my first role. And
Mhm.
so that's just one example. The last thing I'll say is that I also volunteer as a co-director for Girls into VC Fellowship. Girls into VC is an amazing nonprofit organization to help more female to help create more female investors. So we pretty much help uh, undergraduate students learn more about venture capital and help them ultimately land a full-time role in the VC ecosystem. And so volunteering there has really enabled me to understand how to best support individuals and how to best help people get their first role in VC. So also happy to share more about that as well to anyone who wants to reach out.
Really great advice. Love that you basically just said to just get involved, like just research, like do what you can, get some experience. That really goes a long way.
Exactly, yes. And I think ultimately reaching out to people and building your network is what is going to position yourself in a more advantageous situation when you are applying.
Definitely. And on the topic of network, I always love to ask our guests to give a shout out to someone in tech that they are really admiring right now. So whether it's a fellow VC, founder, community builder, would love to hear who you're feeling inspired by lately.
Of course, yes. Would love to give a shout out to my boss, Mark Volchak. So he has inspired me a lot and it really had a major influence in how I think about venture capital. So how I am able to shape my investor framework and perspective and also think about real business value and critical workflows and ultimately be able to understand, what are the attributes that make a company worth investing in and how to analyze startups and businesses and then the last thing I'll say is just ultimately being humble and being able to learn from your own experiences and from other people and I think that's just been such a breath of fresh air is just finding people who are good human beings and really have that drive to succeed and make a positive impact and really think about the ways that they're helping other people in the ecosystem.
Absolutely. Elvia, this has been such a fun episode, and I've so enjoyed having you on the show to share everything that you've been doing at Las Olas. And I'd love to have you share with our listeners where they can find you online in case they'd like to connect.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashley. Really appreciate you having me on board today. In terms of where you guys can find me, feel free to find me on LinkedIn. My name is Elvia Perez. I'm based in Fort Lauderdale. And then in terms of email, like also happy to share my email, whatever would be easiest for you.
Amazing. I'll include those places in the show notes for listeners to easily find you. Thank you so much again for coming on today's episode.
Thank you, Ashley. Really appreciate it.